So today I'll be replacing the brake fluid in my 2008 Kawasaki Concourse 14. Replacing the brake fluid is a simple process, but can be very challenging if you're doing it by yourself because you can't allow any air to enter the brake line, otherwise you are having a bubble that takes forever to get out. So you're constantly having to open and close the caliper bleed valve every time you're opening and closing or pressing the fluid. One of the things that I learned a long time ago is this little product, Speed Bleeders. Has a little check valve, a little ball bearing inside the valve, and as you get positive pressure from your brake lever, the old fluid exits the valve, and when you release the pressure from the lever, there's a little spring-loaded ball bearing inside that closes the valve to prevent any back suction or air coming back into the line. There's two for the front, two for the rear, and one for the clutch. They make these for motorcycles, most cars, and I have to say it's one of the best investments, cheap investments that you can make. These were approximately $35 online for the set. I got my new brake fluid, and let's get to it. We'll begin with the front brake. If you've never changed your brake fluid, you have to make sure not a single drop hits your paint. It will instantly dissolve any paint surface. So unless you like streaks throughout your paint, I recommend putting down a drop cloth on all exposed surfaces, especially anything within the drip area. You'll notice I am using a highly calibrated Pac-Man bedsheet from 1985. Does the best job I've found. You'll need an aquarium hose found at your local hardware store, of course a screwdriver to take off the cap, a 10mm wrench to take out the caliper bleed valve. You'll need a 5/16 wrench to put in the speed bleeder unit. The speed bleeders do not come in metric, but they will fit the brake. So we're going to take out the brake caliper bleed valve, which is located right here. You'll see it has a little dust cover on it. The speed bleeders come with their own. There's one on the other side of the front tire, right there. So we'll need to replace both of those, and then we'll begin bleeding our brakes. So we're about to remove the caliper bleed valve, the original one. So I have my 10mm wrench on. Once we remove this, we're going to replace it with our speed bleeder. Again, this is a 5/16 wrench. You'll notice it already has thread sealer on it. Don't worry about the air that goes into the brake system. We will be removing that anyway in the process of bleeding the brakes. That's why we're doing this. But you'll notice that it does have a double banjo bolt that feeds both line systems. So one loops over the top to the other side of the caliper, and we will have to bleed both sides. So you can now see the speed bleeder has been installed. It's all the way tightened to full stop. Do not over tighten this valve. It will only take a quarter turn to a half turn to open it, at which point the positive pressure from the brake will force the fluid out of the valve and into our hose to bleed the brakes. You'll want to make sure that you clean the area before you remove the old caliper to avoid any contamination, any dirt coming into your system. My brakes were fairly clean. There was no visible dust or mud or debris around this area. So I just gave it a quick wipe down and then installed the bleeder valve. But if you have excess debris, you'll want to make sure that you wash it all away first. Now you'll want to clean off any contamination around the reservoir. So I usually just take some glass cleaner on a rag and wipe down the surface to make sure it's nice and clean. this is where you would start spilling brake fluid on your fairings. So again, make sure you have a highly calibrated drop cloth around your system. There is the cover, reservoir, gasket, and then you'll see the nasty, dirty brake fluid that has to come out of our system. Now you'll notice that it's asking for .4 brake fluid. It's also asking us from a sealed container. A lot of us have brake fluid cans, jars that maybe have been open for a while, and what you have to realize is that that brake fluid is pretty much worthless. The atmosphere has plenty of moisture in it, and as even with a cap, without being a sealed container where it's vacuum stored, that brake fluid is going to absorb moisture. And when it absorbs moisture, well, moisture and air are the enemies of brake fluid. So that's why we're in a closed system with our brake lines, to avoid any contamination with water or with air. And if you are using old brake fluid, you are asking for brake failure. So go ahead and spend the $6 and get yourself new brake fluid. So with the cover removed, you can see the gasket, and you can also see this. You can see the components from the brake reservoir. The gasket, the level float, the cap. You want to make sure that those do not get dirty at all. That's why I put them on a rag. My hose is hooked up to my speed bleeder. Simple quarter turn to the left to open. And with pressure applied to the brake, you can see that the fluid comes out. Now you'll notice that the fluid isn't getting sucked back in. That's actually gravity drainage from the tube going into my jar. But fluid isn't going back into my brake system because that speed bleeder valve is closing it off when there's not any positive pressure. So, simply apply pressure. Now I've already done this once or twice, so my fluid is nice and clean. But as I depress the brake, that fluid is transferred into the brake system, and I'm getting a nice transfer. You want to make sure that you refill this reservoir as much as possible to avoid any air going into the system. Otherwise, you have to wait for the bubble to make its way all the way through the brake system and out. Once you have clean fluid coming back into your jar, which I already have, simply close your speed bleeder valve. Again, not too tight, just snug. And then you should feel positive brake force at the lever. And this is nice and crisp. A lot of nice tension. Wonderful new brake fluid. Replace the gasket. Close up the reservoir. Make sure you have the correct level. And you are done. Fluid's clean, floats back in, rubber gasket is realigned. Once you get done, make sure that you put that little rubber cap on the bleed valve to make sure no dust or debris gets inside your system. And you should have nice sharp brakes. If you still feel like your brakes are mushy, that means you still have air in it. So keep on pumping until you get that bubble out. The bleed valve for the clutch is located down here by the gear shift, right there. Same exact setup. Take it out, put the speed bleeder in, bleed out the system from your reservoir right up there. The hardest problem with the clutch is just the limited space to get the hose on. Quarter turn open for the speed bleeder. And you can see the absolute nasty, nasty brake fluid for the clutch. So I'm going to try to pump as much of this out as I can. And you can see the nasty fluid that needs to get out of there. But again, want to make sure that I don't suck any air into the system. But I do want to try to get as much of that dirty fluid down the pipe as possible before I start diluting it with the clean fluid. You'll find the rear brake reservoir under the seat. And the bleed valves located here and here. Same exact setup. Take out the old one, put in the speed bleeder, close it all the way. Quarter turn one open. Fill up the fluid, close it, do the other side. This is where speed bleeders come in. For every penny, they are totally worth it. Imagine having to open and close that valve while pressing down on that pedal, while simultaneously making sure that reservoir doesn't go dry. With speed bleeders, you don't even worry about the valve. You just worry about the pedal and the reservoir. Those, my friend, are the enemy. The tiny bubbles that makes a brake mushy. Gotta get them all out. Kill them all.